When Jamie Dornan turned 43, he didn't mark the moment with celebration or spectacle. Instead, a quiet admission surfaced at a time no one expected, carrying a weight far heavier than any red carpet moment. It wasn't framed as a confession, yet it immediately unsettled those who heard it. This was not about a role, a project, or a career move. It was about a truth he had deliberately kept out of public reach for years. For more than a decade, Jamie Dornan had embodied one of Hollywood's most controlled public images. He was careful with words, consistent in tone, and rarely gave the media anything unexpected to dissect. While other actors cycled through controversy and reinvention, he stayed remarkably steady. Fans admired his restraint, studios trusted his reliability, and the press labeled him private but grounded. What few considered was whether that calm exterior was less about comfort and more about control. The narrative around him was almost too clean to question. Every interview followed a familiar rhythm, every answer polished just enough to satisfy without revealing too much. When questions drifted toward his inner life, he redirected them smoothly, never defensive but never transparent either. Nothing he said felt false, yet something always felt incomplete. Over time, that incompleteness became invisible simply because it was consistent. Looking back, the signs were there, subtle and easily dismissed. There were moments when his expressions lagged behind his words, when a smile arrived slightly late. Periods where he stepped away from the spotlight without explanation, only to return unchanged on the surface. Fans assumed rest, family priorities, or creative reset. Very few paused to wonder what might have driven that distance. Hollywood rewards reliability, especially in men whose careers are built on stability rather than spectacle. For Jamie, breaking the image carried real risk, not just to public perception but to professional trust. Revealing too much could have shifted how studios, brands, and audiences positioned him. Silence, by contrast, came with reassurance and continuity. Over time, that silence became part of the role he played off-screen. That silence followed him into every public appearance. It shaped interviews where answers were trimmed to safe boundaries and appearances where presence mattered more than honesty. It lingered in years where personal truths were weighed carefully against the cost of exposure. Each decision reinforced the same version of himself, even as the gap between that version and reality quietly widened. The longer it lasted, the harder it became to undo. By the time he reached 43, something had shifted. Age didn't bring panic, but it brought clarity about what sustained restraint actually costs. In a rare moment of openness, Jamie acknowledged something he had avoided naming publicly for years. He didn't dramatize it or seek sympathy, but the firmness in his tone suggested long internal debate. It sounded less like impulse and more like relief. What made the moment unsettling was how understated it was. There was no attempt to soften the impact or control the reaction that might follow. The words felt practiced, not rehearsed for performance, but considered in private over time. He spoke as someone prepared for misunderstanding, even judgment. That readiness made the admission feel irreversible. Living with a divided identity leaves marks that cameras never capture. There is the public figure, repeated until it feels permanent, and the private self adjusted to fit expectations. Maintaining that distance requires constant vigilance, especially under scrutiny. Over time, the effort becomes heavier than the protection it offers. For Jamie, that balance appeared to collapse quietly rather than dramatically. The admission itself didn't accuse anyone or rewrite his past. It simply acknowledged that something essential had been held back for too long. Not because it was shameful, but because it disrupted the image others depended on. The industry had rewarded his restraint while benefiting from the illusion it created. At 43, he seemed to decide that illusion no longer deserved protection. The reaction rippled quickly, even without sensational headlines. Fans replayed the moment, parsing tone and language for deeper meaning. Some felt closer to him, others unsettled by how little they truly knew. What had once felt familiar now felt carefully edited. And once that realization set in, it was difficult to ignore. Because if a truth this significant could remain hidden for so long, it raised a more uncomfortable question. How much of what the public believes is simply what has been allowed to surface? Jamie Dornan's composure began to look less like ease and more like endurance. Less like openness and more like survival. And that question lingered long after the words themselves faded. The admission didn't end with the words themselves. It lingered in the way Jamie Dornan held his posture afterward, steady but visibly unguarded. There was no attempt to walk it back, no clarification issued later to soften its meaning. For someone known for precision, that silence felt intentional. It suggested he understood exactly what he had just changed. Almost immediately, the narrative around him began to shift. Clips were replayed, old interviews resurfaced, and moments once dismissed as insignificant were suddenly re-examined. Fans noticed patterns they had never questioned before, connecting dots that had always been there. What once looked like consistency now appeared calculated. The image that had felt solid began to feel curated. The reaction was not universally supportive. Some praised his honesty, calling it overdue and human. Others questioned why it took so long, wondering what else might still be withheld. A quieter group expressed discomfort, not with the truth itself, but with realizing how invested they had been in a version of him that was incomplete. That discomfort revealed how deeply audiences cling to certainty. In the industry, the response was more restrained but no less significant. Jamie's reputation had always rested on reliability and trust, qualities studios depend on. Speaking openly risked unsettling that balance, even if no lines were crossed. Yet what stood out was that he did not rush to reassure anyone. He allowed the uncertainty to exist, signaling that the truth mattered more than immediate damage control. What became clear was that the admission was not about rewriting his past. It was about reclaiming ownership over it. For years, decisions had been shaped by how they would appear, not how they felt. That calculation had served his career well, but it had also narrowed the space in which he could exist honestly. Saying the truth out loud disrupted that pattern. There is a particular isolation that comes with being admired for the wrong reasons. When praise is attached to restraint rather than authenticity, honesty becomes risky. Jamie's success had been reinforced by not deviating from expectations, even when those expectations felt incomplete. Over time, that praise turns into pressure, and pressure into confinement. The admission was a way out of that confinement. What followed was not chaos, but recalibration. Public appearances took on a different tone, not dramatic, but less guarded. He spoke with fewer qualifiers, fewer rehearsed detours. The change was subtle, yet noticeable to those paying attention. It felt as though he had stopped managing perception and started accepting consequence. That shift also reframed his past choices. Moments once labeled as distance now felt like self-preservation. Years of privacy no longer read as secrecy, but as negotiation with an unforgiving spotlight. The industry rarely allows space for complexity without packaging it. By refusing to package his truth, Jamie forced others to confront that complexity without guidance. Not everyone welcomed that ambiguity. Audiences are accustomed to clean arcs and satisfying explanations. What Jamie offered instead was something unresolved, a truth without instructions on how to feel about it. That refusal to guide reaction unsettled many. It also made the moment feel more genuine. At 43, the stakes were different. He was no longer building a foundation, but deciding what deserved protection. The admission suggested a recalibration of priorities, not driven by decline, but by sustainability. Living honestly, even partially, became more valuable than maintaining an illusion indefinitely. That choice carried risk, but also relief. The most striking part was what he did not say. He didn't outline every detail or seek to control interpretation. He left gaps, allowing others to project, question, and debate. In doing so, he surrendered a level of control he had held tightly for years. That surrender marked the true turning point. Over time, the noise settled, but the impact remained. Jamie Dornan was no longer just the composed figure audiences thought they knew. He had introduced uncertainty into his image, and with it, depth. Some fans felt closer to him, others more distant, but almost no one felt unchanged. That shift alone confirmed the weight of the admission. What this moment ultimately revealed was not scandal, but cost. The cost of silence, the cost of restraint, and the cost of being understood only on the surface. By speaking when he did, Jamie acknowledged those costs without dramatizing them. He didn't frame himself as a victim or a hero. He simply stepped out from behind a version of himself that no longer fit. At 43, the truth didn't arrive as an ending. It arrived as a boundary, drawn quietly but firmly. A line between who he had been required to be and who he was willing to be moving forward. Whether that line leads to greater freedom or greater scrutiny remains to be seen. What is certain is that it cannot be erased. And perhaps that was the point all along.